This is Grandmaster Daniel Naroditsky. We are watching Grandmaster Haik Martirosyan taking on Hikaru Nakamura at the 2022 FIDE World Blitz Championship. And Hikaru with the black pieces, he starts the game off with a knight tango. That's where the two knights come out first without any pawns moving out. Now he moves a pawn out to e6. And this is an opening which often kind of transposes into a Nimzo Indian or sometimes even into a King's Indian. And Hikaru does indeed fianchetto his dark squared bishop, both sides castling, Martirosyan adopting a fianchetto setup of his own. And let's see if he now brings the knight out to c3. Of course, it's important to punish these types of openings, but that is exceedingly hard to do in Blitz, and Hikaru is known for making these offbeat openings work every single time. And Martirosyan, speaking of the double fianchetto, b3 is on the board, and he clearly wants to fianchetto his dark squared bishop out to b2 and lend a little bit more support to that pawn on d4. Hikaru striking in the center with d5. Martirosyan completing the double fianchetto, and Hikaru with a little double fianchetto action of his own with b6. What an interesting, unconventional opening, and let's see if Hikaru does indeed put his light squared bishop on b7. It looks like the American Grandmaster has made this opening setup work as Martirosyan brought his knight out to d2. The position is pretty tame. Both kings are safe. This is going to be most likely a long, drawn-out, fascinating maneuvering struggle. Both sides putting their rooks on c8, copying each other, and Martirosyan buttresses the center with e3. Hikaru brings his knight back to e7. That is a pretty typical idea in these types of positions. That paves the way for a central strike with c7, c5. That may create a pawn box in the center, and it may contribute to what is already a very positionally tense situation. The Armenian Grandmaster, he's down 30 seconds, time to speed up as he centralizes his knight on e5, and Hikaru brings his other knight back to d7, contesting that knight and offering a trade. Black lacks space, and so white wants to keep as many pieces on the board as possible, and that is exactly what Haik does. And there's that c5 move. The pawn cube has been created. The tension is at a peak. Let's see how Martirosyan responds to the move c5. He can take on c5 because his dark squared bishop is protected by his knight, and that is exactly what he does. A little bit of surprise there from Hikaru. Took a couple of moments, and now he's going to take the bishop, and that trade, generally speaking, favors white because that bishop on g7 was doing the very important duty of protecting black's king. But with white's minor pieces a little bit passive here, I don't think Hikaru's king is in any significant danger. b4, that caused a little bit more surprise as Hikaru drops his knight back to d7. Of course, knight d3 there would have been desirable, but it was impossible. The knight on b2 was guarding that square. Now Martirosyan could continue clarifying the situation by taking on d5, but no, instead, he keeps the tension, brings his knight to b3. Hikaru moves his rook up to c7, defending the bishop on b7, and now Hikaru will be the one who takes on c4 if Martirosyan does not respond. He is now down a minute. Slowly but surely, his clock has crept down now to 90 seconds. And let's see what Haik is going to come up with here. c5 is a possibility, but that pawn was likely to become very weak. Instead, he goes for a very quiet approach, a2, a3, protecting the pawn on b4 and tossing the ball back into Hikaru's court. Hikaru doesn't want to take on c4 just yet. Instead, he accentuates the pressure on the c4 pawn. He brings his bishop out to a6 and now drops it right back to b7. This is a common positional idea. He has provoked the push of the b pawn, and that has created, in turn, a very weak square on c5 that Hikaru could use as a jumping off point for his knight. And the American Grandmaster continues to blitz out his moves with just stunning rapidity. He is now well over a minute on the clock. He's got a knight centralized on d5. The position still looks around equal, but things could definitely go haywire if the position continues to heat up. Let's see how Hikaru will continue to expand in the center. He can bring his other knight out to e5, and he could trade rooks. Instead, he moves his knight back to f6, offering a trade now of the other pair of bishops. And Haik, I think he should take that bishop and then put a rook on d1 and try to get some pressure down those b and c files. Not sure about Hikaru's choice to move his knight out of d5, and instead Martirosyan activates his knight and pushes it up to c4 and chisels his way, knifing his way into black's position. He wants to go knight d6, potentially, although that knight on d6 could also end up being a liability. Hikaru shifts his rook back to c7. Now rook fd1 is a natural move here. That's one possibility. Instead, Martirosyan with f3, taking a pretty radical measure there to block the mobility of the knight on f6. He prevents knight e4. He potentially prepares to drive a wedge into the center with e3, e4. And Hikaru is not going to sit idly by and watch that happen. Knight to c5, offering a trade of queens, which Martirosyan accepts. And it does look like black is doing pretty well in this endgame, with his rooks positioned on the 2 open files as Anish Giri there in the background gets a little closer to take a look at this endgame as it unfolds. A knight e5 by the Armenian grandmaster, a creative way to keep the pressure going. That knight on b3, of course, is untouchable because the rook on c7 was going to be hanging, and it said Hikaru drives his rook up to d5. He attacks the knight on e5, and Haik doesn't have too many places to put it because both squares on the c file would allow black to take the knight on b3. They would have blocked the connection between the 2 rooks, and instead Haik is forced to push the pawn up to f4 and protect the knight on a5. But that does give up the e4 square, which Hikaru immediately occupies with his own knight, and he could potentially follow up with f7, f6, chasing the knight out of e5. Haik doesn't have the same luxury because, well, the pawn on f4 cannot move backward. And the knight on e5 is not moving backward. It's moving forward to c6 it goes. And Hikaru brings his king up to f7, waiting for a good opportunity to play e6, e5, and chase the knight out of d4. But right now that move is impossible because the rook on f1 would be pinning the pawn on f6. So Hikaru has to be patient, and patient he is, pushing the pawn up to a5, grabbing space on the queen side and allowing an en passant. But the problem with an en passant is that it would leave the knight on c6 without a crucial defender, although there are some tactics there. En passant, knight takes a6, Haik has to calculate them. He decides to shy away from that option. Instead, he maintains the status quo and doubles his rooks on the c file. Hikaru, in turn, doubling his rooks on the d file. And there's a sense in which the position is about to open up. And will Martirosyan have enough time to handle the consequences as he hastily moves his king up to g2? And Hikaru must be tempted at this point by the possibility of e5, which would reopen the d file and potentially allow for a rook infiltration to d2. But is now the time to play like that? Not yet. Hikaru repeats moves once. Martirosyan is obviously fine with a draw here, but something tells me that Nakamura is going to find a way to tighten the screws and to make the situation as complex as possible. He himself now is down to 15 seconds. Seems a little bit nervous there as he decides how to proceed here. Magnus Carlsen, the world champion, coming over to take a close look. Hikaru's time advantage has now dwindled to 20 seconds. Is he going to acquiesce to the draw here? He almost never does. No, he does not. And there's e5. There's the move that we have been expecting for a while. And we have a trade. The knight drops back to f3. Hikaru's knight, in turn, infiltrating to d3. You can't put the rook on d1 because there was a discovered check there. Instead, the rook moves to f1. The black king slinks away to g7, obviously removing the threat of a discovered attack of white tone. But oh, what a move there. Knight to d6, and that might have been missed by the Armenian grandmaster. The rook is now hanging. The pawn on b5 is incredibly vulnerable. He probably should have pushed a4 when he had a chance. I think he's going to lose that pawn. And if he loses that pawn, that means the knight on c6 is left without a crucial defender. Magnus continues to watch this fascinating endgame struggle as it unfolds. And Hikaru probably deciding not whether to take the pawn on b5, but with which piece to take it. No, he was deciding whether to take it first. He steps on the gas pedal and attacks the pawn on e3, and only now that the rook has been consigned to a passive existence on e2, does he take the pawn on b5. Hikaru now healthily up a pawn, drops the knight back to e7, and he's simplifying the position. 4 seconds for Martirosyan as he quickly tries to smoke the knight up to d3, and Hikaru says, no can do. He drives the rook up to b3. Now the pawn on a3 is about to fall, and the pawn on e4 is hanging. 3 seconds for Martirosyan, and he's dropping more material, but he's still fighting. He takes on e5. He's got some active pieces here. Does Hikaru have a way to finish this game? If he plays knight to c3, forking the 2 rooks, the rook would have gone up to d7. Martirosyan defending tactically. Knight f6, that is a devilish move, but Martirosyan brings his knight back to c4. He counterattacks Hikaru's rook. He is still alive, but there goes black's rook. Now he's got piggies on the 7th. 1 second for the Armenian GM, and he takes on b6. He barely made it there, but the position looks lost. Hikaru is dropping the rooks to the second rank. He's just taken on h2, but where is the crushing blow? I think that Nakamura can just give a check on g2 and take that pawn on g3. Instead, he goes knight h5. That is an even faster win. And Martirosyan, seeing that knight takes g3 and mate is imminent, extends his hand in resignation. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you want more videos like this, make sure to click the link in the playlist for more of these Blitz videos.